You pour a glass of milk and leave it on the counter. In 2 days, it stinks. Medieval peasants left milk out for weeks and drank something safer than what came from the cow. They knew a fermentation trick we spent a century trying to undo, and we are only now realizing what we lost. Before you decide this is another romantic myth about the past, stay with me, because I am going to show you the chemistry they understood without a lab, the diseases they dodged without refrigeration, and the one change in our food system that made us forget how to do this safely. If you want more food science we buried, hit subscribe now. Let me be clear about what fermentation meant to them. It was not a cooking hobby. It was not artisan anything. It was survival technology. You grew cabbage in summer, you had no fridge, no canning equipment, no freezer. In 4 months, that cabbage would rot into slime and you would starve. Guess fermentation was the biochemical hack that turned a head of cabbage into something that stayed edible until spring and became more nutritious in the process. Here is the thing we forgot. Fermentation is not just preservation. It is a controlled spoilage process that crowds out the dangerous microbes before they can take hold. Medieval peasants did not know the word lactobacillus, but they knew that if you kept vegetables submerged in salty brine and kept air out, the result would not kill you. Then they were managing microbial succession, pH drops, and competitive exclusion, all without seeing a single cell. The science behind it is simple but exact. When you submerge vegetables in brine, you create an environment where salt-tolerant lactic acid bacteria thrive, and almost everything else struggles. Those bacteria eat the sugars in the vegetables and produce lactic acid. The acid drops the pH fast, usually within 3 to 5 days, down to around 4 or lower. At that pH, the pathogens that cause food poisoning, the Clostridium, the E. coli, the Listeria, they cannot reproduce. The vegetable is now preserved, and you did not add vinegar. You did not heat anything. You let bacteria do the work. Here is what matters. That pH drop happens in a sequence. In the first 2 days, a mix of bacteria start working. By day 3, lactobacillus species dominate. By day 5, acid is high enough that spoilage organisms die off. Medieval peasants did not have pH meters, but they had taste and smell and generations of pattern recognition. If it smelled right and tasted sour but clean, it worked. If it smelled like rot, something went wrong, usually air exposure or not enough salt. Now we have fridges, and we stopped fermenting vegetables at home. We bought shelf-stable pickles instead. But here is the trick. Most pickles in the supermarket are not fermented. They are cucumbers soaked in vinegar with preservatives. No bacteria, no probiotic benefit. No pH crash from microbial action, just acid added from a jug. It tastes sour, but it is a chemical shortcut. The medieval version was alive. The modern version is a vinegar bath that we call a pickle. We swapped microbial fermentation for industrial acid, and we lost the biology. Let me give you numbers to anchor this. A naturally fermented sauerkraut at peak fermentation contains around 1 billion live lactic acid bacteria per gram. Your gut has roughly 100 trillion microbes total, and the diversity of that population matters for immune function, digestion, and even mental health. Fermented foods deliver joie reinforcements. Modern vinegar pickles deliver 0. We do not have long-term studies comparing medieval gut microbiomes to ours, but we do know that populations eating traditional fermented foods have lower rates of certain inflammatory and autoimmune conditions. The link is not proven causally in every case, but the correlation is consistent across cultures. And here is another thing they understood. Fermentation makes nutrients more available. Cabbage contains vitamin C, but it also contains compounds that bind minerals and make them harder to absorb. Fermentation breaks down some of those anti-nutrients. It also produces new vitamins. Lactic acid bacteria synthesize certain B vitamins during fermentation, so the sauerkraut you eat has more bioavailable nutrition than the raw cabbage you started with. Peasants did not know the word bioavailability, but they knew kraut kept scurvy away on long winters better than raw cabbage stored in a cellar. Now, dairy. This is where the forgotten knowledge gets wild. You cannot store fresh milk without refrigeration. It spoils in a day, maybe 2 in cool weather. But if you let the right bacteria ferment it, you get something that lasts weeks and is safer to drink than fresh milk. Cultures across medieval Europe made versions of this. In Scandinavia, it was filmjölk. In the Caucasus, kefir. In the Balkans, yogurt. Every one of them used wild or backslopped cultures, meaning they saved a bit of the last batch to start the next. They were maintaining live bacterial cultures across generations, passing them down like heirlooms. Here is the microbial trick. Fresh milk has a pH around 6.7. It is close to neutral, and pathogens can grow in it easily. When lactic acid bacteria ferment milk, they drop the pH to around 4.5 in 12 to 24 hours. At that pH, most pathogens cannot survive. The milk sours, but it does not rot. It thickens into yogurt or a drinkable cultured milk, and it stays good for weeks, even without refrigeration, because the acid and the live bacteria keep competing organisms out. This is controlled spoilage. The bacteria you want outcompete the bacteria you do not. We stopped doing this at scale when pasteurization arrived in the late 19th century. Pasteurization kills pathogens in milk by heating it, yet which made milk safer to drink fresh and allowed centralized dairies to ship it long distances. That was a genuine public health win, but it also killed all the bacteria, good and bad, and it made us dependent on refrigeration. We traded microbial management for thermal processing and cold chains. In doing so, we forgot how to ferment dairy at home. Most people today think yogurt comes from a store, not from a jar of milk left out with a spoonful of yesterday's yogurt. Here is what medieval fermentation required: salt, in the case of vegetables, starter culture or wild fermentation in the case of dairy, and an anaerobic environment, meaning no air, temperature control, but not refrigeration. Most fermentation happens best between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Too hot, and you get spoilage. Too cold, and fermentation stalls. Peasants kept crocks in cool cellars or corners of the house. They used weight stones to keep vegetables submerged. They covered jars with cloth to keep out flies but let gas escape. They managed variables we now control with appliances. Let me tell you what went wrong in the 20th century. Industrialization and food safety regulation correctly targeted pathogens, but they also targeted all bacteria. The logic was simple. If bacteria can kill you, eliminate bacteria. Pasteurize milk, sterilize cans, refrigerate everything, add preservatives. It worked. Deaths from foodborne illness dropped. But we also wiped out beneficial bacteria from our diets. We stopped fermenting at home because we did not need to. And within 2 generations, the knowledge evaporated. Go into a random kitchen today and ask someone how to make sauerkraut. Most will say, buy it from a store. Here is the other loss. Flavor complexity. Fermented foods taste different from their raw or vinegar-soaked counterparts. The bacteria produce not just acid, but esters, alcohols, and volatile compounds that create depth. A naturally fermented pickle tastes tangy, slightly funky, alive. A vinegar pickle tastes sharp and flat. Medieval food was not bland. It was intensely flavored because fermentation was everywhere. Bread was sourdough, naturally leavened with wild yeast and bacteria. Beer was sour and low alcohol, a daily drink for adults and children because it was safer than water. Meat was cured and fermented into sausages. Dairy was cultured. They lived in a world of complex, sour, funky flavors. We live in a world of salt, sugar, and neutral. Now, I will tell you how to do this yourself, because it is simpler than the food industry wants you to believe. For vegetables, you need 3 things: fresh vegetables, salt, and a jar. Chop the vegetables. Cabbage is easiest, but cucumbers, carrots, beets, and radishes all work. Dissolve salt in water at about 2 to 3% by weight. That is roughly 1 tablespoon per 2 cups of water. Pack the vegetables into a jar and pour the brine over them until they are submerged. Weigh them down with a small glass or a fermentation weight. Cover loosely or use an airlock lid. Leave at room temperature for 3 to 7 days. Taste daily. When it is sour enough for you, move it to the fridge to slow fermentation. That is it. For dairy, you need milk and a starter culture. If you want yogurt, heat milk to 180 degrees Fahrenheit to denature proteins. Then cool it to 110 degrees. Stir in a few tablespoons of live yogurt. Keep it warm, around 110 degrees, for 6 to 12 hours. The bacteria ferment the lactose, produce acid, and the milk thickens. You can keep it warm in an oven with the light on, in a dehydrator, or wrapped in towels. Once it is thick and tangy, refrigerate it. Save some to start your next batch. Here is the safety part. People worry about botulism, about poisoning themselves. Let me be direct. Botulism requires an anaerobic, low-acid, low-salt environment. Fermented vegetables are acidic and salty. Botulism does not grow there. If your ferment smells foul, like rot or decay, throw it out. If it smells sour and clean, it is safe. Trust your nose. Medieval peasants did. If fermentation were deadly, Europe would have depopulated itself centuries ago. Here is what we are relearning now. The human gut microbiome is not just a bonus feature. It regulates immune response. It synthesizes vitamins, breaks down toxins, and communicates with the brain through the gut-brain axis. When you eat live fermented foods, you are not just getting probiotics. You are getting the metabolites those bacteria produce, the acids and enzymes and compounds that feed your own microbes. The link between gut health and chronic disease is one of the hottest areas in medical research right now, and every direction it goes points back to what peasants were eating every day. Here is the economic angle. Fermentation costs nearly nothing. Cabbage is cheap, salt is cheap, time is free. A jar of naturally fermented sauerkraut from a health food store costs $8 and contains 2 cups. You can make a gallon at home for $2. The markup is not for the food. It is for the knowledge you forgot. The food industry is not interested in teaching you techniques that cost them sales. They would rather sell you probiotic pills and shelf-stable pickles. Here is the taste test you can do right now. Buy a jar of naturally fermented sauerkraut from the refrigerated section. Read the label. It should say cabbage, water, salt, and nothing else. Then buy a jar of shelf-stable sauerkraut from the regular aisle. That one is pasteurized. Taste them side by side. The live one tastes bright, complex, tangy. The dead one tastes like salty vinegar mush. That difference is what we lost. Let me tell you what medieval peasants did not have. They did not have sterile environments. They did not have temperature controllers or pH meters. They did not have microbiology textbooks. What they had was observation, repetition, and survival pressure. If the fermentation failed, you went hungry. If it worked, you taught your children exactly how you did it. Knowledge transfer was oral, hands-on, and multi-generational. We replaced that with factories and fridges, and the skills died in 2 generations. Here is the modern irony. We now buy expensive probiotics in capsules, shelf-stable for months, freeze-dried and encased in plastic. Those capsules contain bacterial strains isolated in labs, often species that do not even colonize the human gut long-term. Meanwhile, a jar of homemade sauerkraut contains billions of live bacteria from dozens of species in a food matrix that protects them through stomach acid for pennies. We are buying back, in pharmaceutical form, what we threw away in food form. And here is what you should look for if you want real fermented food. In vegetables, check the label. Ingredients should be vegetables, water, salt, and maybe spices. If you see vinegar, it is not fermented. If it is on a shelf at room temperature and not in a refrigerated section, it has been pasteurized and the bacteria are dead. For dairy, look for the words live and active cultures. If it says contains live cultures after pasteurization, those cultures were added back after heating. And that is fine. If it does not say live cultures at all, it is sterile. Here is the bigger picture. Fermentation is a decentralized technology. It works at any scale. 1 jar or 1,000 jars, the process is the same. It requires no electricity, no supply chain, no patents. It is a technology that belongs to everyone because it belongs to bacteria, and bacteria are everywhere. The medieval peasant and the modern homesteader do the exact same thing. Pack it, salt it, wait. Yes, the bacteria do the rest. Here is the last piece of forgotten knowledge. Fermentation was not just for food, it was for medicine. Fermented honey, called mead or honey wine, was used as an antiseptic. Fermented cabbage juice was given to people with stomach ailments. Kefir was considered a cure for digestive problems in the Caucasus. Were these miracle cures? No. But were they better than nothing, and sometimes genuinely helpful? Yes. And because they delivered live bacteria and acids that could outcompete pathogens in the gut. Here is what I want you to take away. Medieval peasants were not smarter than us. They were more constrained. They had no fridge, so they had to ferment or starve. Necessity taught them microbial ecology in the form of recipes and timing and taste. We have the luxury of refrigeration, and we used it to forget an entire class of food technology. But that technology still works. Yet the bacteria have not changed. The chemistry has not changed. The only thing that changed is that we stopped doing it. If you want to try this, start with 1 jar of sauerkraut. Chop cabbage, add salt, submerge it, and wait. Taste it every day. Watch the bubbles form. Smell the clean, sour tang. That is bacteria working. That is the same process that kept people alive for thousands of years. It still works. You do not need a degree. You do not need special equipment. You need a jar, some salt, and the willingness to trust a process older than your great-great-grandmother. Subscribe if you want more forgotten food science. I find the techniques we buried under industrial convenience, and I test whether they still work. Most of them do. This one absolutely does. Now, let me address something you might be thinking. This all sounds good in theory, but what about the real world? What about the risk? What about the fact that you have been taught your whole life that fermentation is risky? That food safety means sterility, that bacteria are the enemy? That fear is understandable. It comes from a real place. In the 19th century, before we understood germ theory, fermented foods sometimes did go wrong. Sometimes people got sick. Sometimes they got very sick. When Pasteur and Lister showed us that bacteria cause disease, the response was logical. Eliminate bacteria, kill everything, make food sterile. But here is what happened next. We applied that logic too broadly. Yet we killed the good bacteria along with the bad ones. We created a world where all bacteria became suspect, where fermentation became a lost art, where the only safe food was food that had been heated or chemically preserved or refrigerated. And it worked, in a way. Food poisoning rates did drop. But we paid a price we are only now starting to calculate. Consider this. For 10,000 years, humans fermented foods. For billions of people across thousands of cultures, some fermentation was not a dangerous gamble. It was the reliable foundation of their diet. They had one advantage we do not. They knew what success looked like. They could taste it, smell it, see it. Their grandmother knew, their mother knew, they knew. What we lost is not just the technique. It is the confidence in your own senses. It is the belief that your nose knows better than a food safety label. It is the understanding that a jar of sauerkraut that smells clean and tastes sour is fundamentally different from a jar that smells rotten. Medieval peasants trusted their senses because they had to. We have been taught to distrust them. Here is what the science actually says about fermentation safety. Documented cases of botulism from fermented vegetables are vanishingly rare in the historical record. Yet the combination of salt and acid that fermentation produces is hostile to the Clostridium botulinum bacterium. It cannot grow there. It does not want to grow there. The environment is wrong. This is not theoretical. This is consistent, reproducible chemistry. What can go wrong with fermentation? Usually one of 3 things. First, not enough salt. Salt controls which bacteria can start the process. Without enough salt, other microorganisms get a foothold. Second, air exposure. Mold grows on the surface if your vegetables are not submerged. Mold is not dangerous in fermented vegetables the way it is in soft foods, but it tastes bad and it signals that something went wrong. Third, temperature extremes. Too hot, and spoilage organisms race ahead of the good bacteria. Too cold, and fermentation stalls indefinitely. But none of these create botulism. They create failure, not poison. The medieval knowledge on this was simple. If it looks normal, smells sour and clean, and tastes right, eat it. If it looks fuzzy or smells like rot, throw it out. That heuristic worked for thousands of years. It will work for you. I want to tell you about something else we forgot. The transition period. When fermentation starts, there is a brief window where the pH is not yet low enough to stop pathogens, but the bacteria are already working. This window is usually 1 to 2 days. During this time, the environment is slightly risky if pathogens are present. But here is the thing. Fresh vegetables in your kitchen are already exposed to pathogens. Your cutting board has pathogens. Your hands have pathogens. The water you use has pathogens if you are in certain parts of the world. Fermentation does not introduce new risk. It manages existing risk by creating an environment that kills pathogens faster than they can reproduce. Medieval peasants solved this problem with cleanliness and tradition. And they use the same fermentation crock for the same vegetables year after year. They developed starter cultures in that crock, bacteria that dominated the space because they had been doing it successfully for generations. They inoculated each new batch with a piece of cloth or a spoonful of the previous batch, seeding the environment with the right bacteria from the start. This is backslopping, and it is how you short-circuit the risky transition period. By day one, and you have billions of the right bacteria already at work. You can do this too. Make your first batch of sauerkraut using wild fermentation. Let the bacteria on the cabbage itself start the process. It will be fine. By day 2 or 3, the lactic acid bacteria will have taken over and the pH will be dropping. Then, for every batch after that, save a spoonful of your finished sauerkraut as a starter. Mix it into the brine of your next batch. Now, you have a living culture. And pass down from your own first successful fermentation. You become the medieval peasant. You become the one transmitting knowledge just by keeping a jar alive. Here is something else worth mentioning. The flavor profile changes over time. Your ferment does not reach one peak and stop. It evolves. Days 3 to 5, it starts getting tangy. Days 7 to 10, it gets funkier, more complex. Days 14 to 21, it develops what fermentation people call the tertiary flavors, the deep and complex notes that come from longer bacterial activity. If you leave it too long at room temperature, it can eventually become vinegary, but that takes months without refrigeration. Most people hit their sweet spot somewhere between 5 and 14 days, then move it to the fridge to slow everything down. The refrigerator does not stop fermentation. It slows it dramatically. In the fridge, fermented foods continue to develop, very slowly, for months. Thus, a jar of sauerkraut made in September can still be improving in March. This is why traditional fermented foods in cold climates often tasted better in spring than in fall. They had been maturing all winter. Let me tell you about the economic reality one more time, because it matters. A small jar of naturally fermented sauerkraut from Whole Foods costs about $8. That jar was made in an industrial facility, transported in refrigerated trucks, and marked up for retail. The cabbage, its water and salt in that jar cost the maker perhaps 50 cents. The rest is overhead, labor, distribution, and profit. That is fine. They provide a service. But a head of cabbage costs $1. A container of salt costs $2 and will make 100 jars. A used glass jar costs nothing. Your first gallon of sauerkraut costs $3 and contains 5 jars worth of food. After that, every batch uses only fresh vegetables. The economics are not the point, though. What the point is independence. If you know how to ferment, you are not dependent on a supply chain. You are not dependent on refrigeration if something breaks. You are not dependent on the store being open. You are not dependent on a brand deciding to discontinue your favorite product. You have a skill that works with things you can grow or find anywhere. This is why governments have historically encouraged fermentation. In Korea, its kimchi production was subsidized and protected as a cultural resource. In Germany, sauerkraut production was considered essential, not because fermented foods are miraculous health foods, but because they are resilient, scalable, and they extend the productive harvest season into months when fresh food does not exist. This is technology disguised as tradition. Here is what happens when you start fermenting regularly. You begin to understand your environment in a way you did not before. Yes, you notice temperature changes, you taste subtle shifts in flavor, you develop intuition about when something is done. You stop trusting labels and start trusting process. You become, in a small way, the person your great-great-grandmother was. You join a lineage of people who learned to work with bacteria instead of against them. And here is the beautiful part. Once you understand fermentation, you see it everywhere. That sourdough bread you bought, fermentation. That cheese, fermentation plus time. That hot sauce with depth and funk, probably fermented. That kombucha you see in every coffee shop now, fermentation of tea with a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. We never actually stopped fermenting. We just outsourced it to factories and forgot we were eating fermented food. The DIY fermentation movement happening right now, the one you see online, is not trendy. It is people remembering. It is people realizing that the technology works, that it is not hard, and that it tastes better than what they can buy. It is people deciding that maybe, just maybe, the medieval peasant knew something about food that we lost. So, if you are sitting there thinking about whether to try this, do it. The worst that happens is you make something that tastes bad and you throw it out. A jar of cabbage costs nothing. Your time costs nothing if you enjoy it. And the best that happens is you join a million years of human food tradition. It's you develop a skill that makes you more independent. You improve your nutrition, you save money, and you taste flavors that industrial food cannot deliver. Start simple. 1 jar. Cabbage, salt, water. That is it. Set it on your counter, come back tomorrow and smell it. The day after, taste it. Let me know how it goes. I genuinely want to know. There is something profoundly satisfying about the first time you ferment something successfully. You made living food, you managed bacteria. You did what humans have been doing since we figured out agriculture. Thank you for staying with me through this. If you found this valuable, if you want to remember food science we buried, if you want to learn techniques that work and test whether the old ways are still better, please subscribe. I cover forgotten food technology, I actually make this stuff, and I show you whether it is real or nostalgia. New videos every week. Thanks for watching.